The furnace is turned off, so we've got to do it on body heat and light bulbs. This will be the last time we meet until the 23rd of January. Long, long break. And then we will meet every week from then on. Maybe breaks for Easter, and once in a while I might go to a basketball game or something like that. So, and this will be the last time that we cover folk tales for a while. And I'm going to, if I do anything with folk tales anymore, I'm going to try and weave them inside of the bigger myths that we're doing. We have two folk tales this time. The first one is from Turkey. It's called The Magic Turban, The Magic Whip, and The Magic Carpet. And the reason I've chosen it is I wanted to show that this almost identical themes appear in different cultures. It's from a Dover book. Dover has all kinds of fairy tale books. I think maybe I have 20 of them. And it develops a theme that we sort of have left hanging from last time. It's the theme of the two brothers. And it demonstrates that the polarization doesn't necessarily have to be destructive or filled with enmity and rancor, but it can be a very positive thing. So we're going to have to, because I didn't have much time again, we're going to have to read instead of just plain tell stories, but that's all right. It'll be less reading, more talking. Once upon a time, that was no time, there were two brothers. Their father and mother had died and divided all their property between them. The elder brother opened a shop, but the younger brother, who was but a featherbrain, idled about and did nothing. So that at last, what with eating and drinking and gadding abroad, the day came when he had no more money left. Then he went to his elder brother and begged a copper or two of him, and when that was all spent, he came to him again, and so he continued to live upon him. We have, since Lewis here, I've been putting in more psychology because a lot more excitement in things like that. It is clearly, again, that the union of the parents must die in order for the polarization to take place. If we're thinking about this in a cosmological sense, or if we're thinking about this in any kind of whole, in order to understand the internal of that whole, there must be at least a dialogue, if not a greater internal division. But when that consciousness is put into a consciousness of knowledge that comes about by division, then the unity is lost, and it's sort of like the parents are dead. It's sort of the idea that is here. And the idea is also that everything that they had went into the duality. It's saying that the two poles of something, or the two sides of an issue, in some ways indicate everything that is in the whole except with the outlook of the whole. An interesting thing that comes in here, and it works not only for people, but it works for ideas, or at least it works that way for me. I've been taking breaks at work. When I take breaks at work, I play on the computer. I play solitary. It's a game called Klondike. And the whole thing is you can play your game of solitary, and then you can go back and you can replay the same game. And sometimes you can replay the same game with 7 or 8 different results compared to what you did with each of the others. And you notice that if you develop some things before other things, that the outcome is a totally different consequence. And the same thing is true with children in a family. Second children are always, or almost always, at least in our society where individualism is praised and prized, second children are always very much different from the first. And in fact, in a family of 4, they'll each be significantly different. And part of the reason for this is that there is a natural competition. But the younger children, the second, tries to compete with the child that is older, but it can't do it because it's behind in the development train. So in order to keep its self-respect, it has to do something different. So in the case of the 2 brothers, the first one is as usual, because the parents with the first children try to do a especially good job, and if anything, they overparent. And as a consequence, the older children are overly conscientious and overly careful and conservative and such like that. The next one along is likely to be very much different. The same thing is true anytime there is a hierarchical consciousness. This is what is behind. We're going to go into next year, I think, if I continue this course next year. I want to do hierarchies of gods as they were done in different societies and at different times of history. But if there are generations of gods, the same thing is there. And any time that there is any creative process where something starts with an initial creative impulse and intuition or a creative idea, the manifestations, first, second, third, they alternate to keep balance, but they each variate, and they variate not only for the balance, but to bring out a creative kind of fulfillment. And I don't know if there is something formulametric so that the first generation, this is going to be what I'm going to be studying and thinking about between now and next fall, is the different hierarchies and to see whether there is a creative formula, and looking at the different forms of cosmology among the mysteries to see whether there is something common in that formula. The younger or the first always indicates the newest, and the older always indicates the older stuff, and the older stuff is the known, and it's the past, whereas the younger children represent the future. They are also not as bound as the conscientious older children, so when something very new is born in a character, you expect that to come in a younger child, and therefore there's more flexibility and more suited to growth. This is a common formula that you find in all cosmology, in that the first half of all things is considered Saturnian or involutionary, and the second half is always considered Jupiterian or evolutionary. The first half is contractive and the second half is expansive. In the Rosicrucian cosmology, for example, the whole beginning of the first half of the evolution is the Saturn period, and from there on everything concentrates and everything contracts. The universe gets smaller and smaller. And in the Jupiterian, the Earth period being the turning point, in the Jupiterian beginning of the second half, the expansion and the widening of consciousness. This Saturn half is the first half. It is a taking and a holding half, whereas the Jupiterian second half is a giving and an outpouring half, and it's much more creative and it's much more future-oriented. So the same principles that are in child development are also in cosmology, and they're in there because that is logical. Very early Greek poets, one of the earliest poems that I ever read by the Greeks is just a little 4-line fragment that goes back to the times of Hesiod or before, and it is an early Greek lyric poet who writes, I see the way, I see the wisdom, I forego Saturn, for him it was Kronos, and I take the way of Zeus, meaning to say that he has taken the shift. Let's see. The younger brother, which is of the future, and has all of that flexibility, obviously, in the sense that we're looking at hero myths, represents the individuality rather than the personality, because the personality is much, much older. We learn things through experience first before the creative potencies are unfolded. Like we had the experiences of being beat around as form before we had the ability to develop will in the early Saturn period. So the individuality, the spirit, which is just beginning to wake up, is always indicated by something very youthful. Okay. At last, the older brother began to grow tired of this waste, but seeing that he could not be quit of his younger brother, he turned all of his possessions into sequins and embarked on a ship in order to go into another kingdom. The younger brother, however, had got wind of it, and before the ship started, he managed to creep on board and conceal himself without anyone observing him. The elder brother suspected that if the younger one heard of his departure, he would be sure to follow after. So he took good care not to show himself on deck. But scarcely had they unfurled sails when the two brothers came face to face, and the elder brother found himself saddled with his younger brother again. Yeah. In some ways, personality, the spirit does seem like a weight, and it almost always seems to be pilfering away all of our experience. But to go back to themes that we've been looking at before, this is the same as the last myth we were looking at with Danae and Perseus, and before that with Danis, the attempt to flee. Never yet was there a willing prophet, and everyone has tried to get out of it and stay away from. They know that it's going to be a difficult life. But whether we look at it in horizontal or whether we look at it in vertical, even in horizontal, the extremism is such that if one pole is asserted to try and free itself from the other, it seems to almost end up in the same ground as the other. And the greater the extremism, the more likely it is to beget its own extreme. And we find that same thing here, like the left-wing anarchists that are left over from the flower children. They were not even flower children as much as the leftists. They are now hide themselves out in the hills here in Wisconsin, and they grow their organic fruit, and they think everything is a conspiracy. And then they go to natural foods conventions and organic farmer conventions, and who do they mingle with? They mingle with the extreme right, with the posse comitatus and all of those sorts of people. Like you can't flee from each other. Myself, I've been an extremist in the vertical. I've tried to live a life of material abandon. That is, I've tried to abandon the material and have tried to live a life that is holy, beyond my own capabilities, and I always get my nose rubbed back into the material again. So in either case, it is a matter of you can't escape because you're bound together. The elder brother was not a little angry, but what was the use of that? For the ship did not stop till it came to Egypt. There the elder brother said to the younger, "Thou stay here, I will go and get 2 mules that we may go on further." The youth sat down on the shore and waited for his brother, and waited, but waited in vain. "I think I had better look for him," he thought, and up he got and went after his brother. He went on and on and on. He went a short distance, and he went a long distance. 6 months he was crossing a field. But once, as he looked over his shoulder, he saw that for all his walking, he had walked no further than a barley stalk reaches. Interesting. This has relativity both of time and of space. Makes it very clear the time that was no time. This is a space that is no space. We know it's an inner world kind of thing. Then he strode still more. He strode still further. He strode for a half a year continuously. He kept plucking violets as he went along, and as he went striding, his feet struck upon a hill, and there he saw 3 youths quarreling with one another about something. He soon made a 4th and asked them what they were tussling about. We have the same theme, if you look at it, we have the same theme that we had in the very last myth. Last time we left off talking about the myth of Perseus being an esoteric star lore myth, indicating how the esoteric students ponder something in the stars in the nighttime, and then when the sun focuses those same stars into the daytime a half a year later, that information becomes exoteric. And so in this case, he's 6 months walking across the field, which is obviously a plain. It's a plain of some kind or another, and when it goes no further than a length of barley, that's the sort of kind of relativity that you have, that the inner planes are right here, and when you cross a plane to the inner planes, you can be located from the 3-dimensional outlook, you can be located in the same place as space. This time something different is done, and I really like this story in some regards, because instead of having 3 hags, we have 3 young men. In the past we had hags or crones, and eventually we're going to have Norns as 3 old ones. Now this is perfectly appropriate, because in all of the other stories, like in East of the Sun and West of the Moon, or in the 2 caskets, it was Perseus that was the other one that had the hags. We were looking at a historical sense, that they were not supposed to look back. And the hags in that regard represent the 3 attributes of the Spirit in a receptive, ancient way. It's as if to say that the Threefold Spirit was built into us a long time ago, but it was primarily a receptive vehicle, and it was not an active vehicle. Now when we have the case of a very young man who is becoming a hero and awakening, this is like saying that the self, or the spiritual ego, not the personal ego, but the spiritual ego, as it finds itself on the spiritual path, the 3 now become youthful. They become youthful because they are now self-conscious attributes. It's not something where one is influenced by something unconscious from the past, but it is something that they're taking them into active power. And where in actual physical generation, the feminine is always receptive, and the masculine is always assertive. Therefore, they're not hags, but they're young men or boys, meaning to say that they're not only youthful, but they're positive and active and assertive. Again, he comes to a high point after crossing a plain. We've talked before about mountains being higher or elevated states of consciousness. And in this instance, he again makes a foursome. And when we were talking about the casket in the myth of Perseus, and at other times, we said that the fourth, that the casket represented the three dimensions of space being united in becoming a tetrahedron. And he becomes the fourth, the self, or the center of it, that utilizes the other three attributes of space. It's sort of like saying that he becomes the eye of it. And so we have an innocent young man going through the spiritual side of the initiatory work. All right, this is going along. We won't even be very long, even with two little short stories. We are the children of one father, said the youngest of them, and our father has just died and has left us by way of inheritance a turban, a whip, and a carpet. Whoever puts the turban on his head is hidden from mortal eyes. Whoever extends himself on the carpet and strikes it once with the whip can fly far away after the manner of birds. And we are eternally quarreling among ourselves as to whose shall be the turban, whose the whip, and whose the carpet. All three of them must belong to one of us, cried they all. They are mine because I am the biggest, said one. They are mine by right because I am the middling-sized brother, cried the second. They are mine because I am the smallest, cried the third. From words they speedily came to blows, so that it was as much that the youth could do to keep them apart. You can't settle it like that, he said. I'll tell you what we'll do. I'll make an arrow from this little piece of wood and shoot it off. You run after it, and he who brings it to me soonest shall have all three things. Away flew the dart, and after it pelted the three brothers helter-skelter. But the wise youth, who knew a trick or two of that, for he stuck the turban on his head, sat down on the carpet, tapped it once with the whip, and cried, "Hip-hop, let me be where my elder brother is." And when he awoke, a large city lay before him. So we have something here again. It's the story of spiritual vehicles. We've seen the spiritual vehicles in all sorts of different senses. We have the same thing that we had. We had the helmet of invisibility that Perseus wore, being associated with the power of will to make one appear invisible. The will is associated with the forces of dissolution that take things back into the unknown absolute. And so the turban has that same quality. And the turban adds a little understanding that we didn't have before, because the turban is a manifestation of the idea of a culminatory spiral. Things spiral and rise until you get to the very peak, and when you're at the very peak, you're then ready to enter into the invisible. The carpet, as we saw when we talked about the myth of Susanoo, stands for the life spirit and the soul body. The soul body being woven out of the ethers and woven from strands of experience, and it is in a way passive and protective. The quality of the life spirit is the resolver of the struggle between the divine spirit and the human spirit. It's the preserver in the trinity of creation, preservation, and generation, or creation, preservation, and destruction. The human spirit is the receptive, it's associated in the individuality in the mind and reflected into the desire body, which is the motivation to move and drive things to other places, and it has the whip-like deftness of the mind. In this story, the vehicles, especially the whip and the rug or carpet, are tied together more closely. It's like saying the self that is the individuality in which the general focus of will of the Threefold Spirit is located is dependent or necessary for selfness. It's like saying in the reflections that the desire body needs a movable body like the vital body to have something to drive. And so this is a really, in some ways, to me, it's a wonderful story to play off with the creative imagination as far as spiritual things are going. The fourth is, again, as we just said, the focus of the higher. This is clearly this is called the Immaculate Conception, and the true hero, the Christ or the Buddha, is always born of an Immaculate Conception, that is, of the divine Father, Mother, and mind. Out of that comes a self, and it's clear that that's what it is. Again, we have all of the mysteries are ruled by Mercury, and it is by his wits or by his mind that he comes into his powers, and the actual focal use of them, whether they be for a higher transcendental self-knowledge through reflecting off the mind, or whether utilizing them for experience within the phenomenal creation, it is the mind that does what it does. So the arrow is just a projection of throwing off, because when it comes to the vehicles, they have to be distracted. The more we can keep the physical body working, and the more we can keep the desire body desiring things that are of a good and positive nature rather than a selfish, self-indulgent nature, the more quickly we'll go on the path. He had scarce taken more than a couple of steps through the street when the Padishah's herald came along and proclaimed to the inhabitants of the town that the Sultan's daughter disappeared every night from the palace. Whoever could find out what became of her should receive the damsel and half the kingdom. Here am I, cried the youth. Lead me to the Padishah, and if I don't find out, let them take my head. So they brought the fool into the palace, and in the evening there lay the Sultan's daughter watching, her eyes half closed, all that was going on. The damsel was only waiting for him to go to sleep, and presently she stuck a needle into her heel, took the candle with her lest the youth should awake, and went out by a side door. The youth had his turban on his head in a trice, and no sooner had he popped out of the same door than he saw a large Ifrit standing there with a golden buckler on his head, and on that buckler sat the Sultan's daughter. And they were just on the point of starting off. The lad was not such a fool as to fancy that he could keep up with him by himself, so he also leaped into the buckler and very nearly upset the pair of them in consequence. The Ifrit was alarmed and asked the damsel in Allah's name what she was about, as they were within a hair's breadth of falling. I never moved, said the damsel. I am sitting on the buckler just as you put me there. The large Ifrit had scarcely taken a couple of steps when he felt that the buckler was unusually heavy. The youth's turban naturally made him invisible, so the Ifrit turned to the damsel and said, My Sultana, thou art so heavy today that I all but break down beneath thee. Darling Lala, replied the girl, thou art very odd tonight, for I am neither bigger nor smaller than I was yesterday. Shaking his head, the huge Ifrit pursued his way, and they went on till they came to a wondrously beautiful garden, where the trees were made of nothing but silver and diamonds. The youth broke off a twig and put it in his pocket, when straightway the trees began to sigh and weep and say, there's a child of man here who tortures us. There's a child of man here who tortures us. The Ifrit and the damsel looked at each other. They sent a youth into me today, said the damsel. Maybe his soul is pursuing us. So, the plot thickens. We have the same thing that we had with Perseus and that we have with all heroes, a kind of innocence and an almost cocky kind of courage. The only thing that we can have to take us beyond this world is that industry and courage that drives us a little further. So the characteristic, even the heroine, that if we remember in the two caskets, had that same kind of innocence and courage. The man offers himself in decapitation. And that can be looked at a number of ways. In the ancient mysteries, the skull, because it was basically shaped spherically, was represented like the dot on the iota. It represented the rising above the polar physical body. And so it represented the spiritual consciousness. This is why even in ancient South America they made those skulls of pure crystal, perfect crystal with no flaws in them, that they could see into the skull. So in one way it's seen as the higher sphere of consciousness. To the Christian mystic, Jerusalem with Golgotha at the head of it represents that same thing. In another way, the head represents everything that is dead and dying. The last shall be first, and of the three organisms in our body associated with the three forces of the spirit, willing, feeling, and thinking, the metabolic system, which is associated with the locomotion and the metabolism of things, is associated with the willing of the divine spirit. The circulatory system, which is fluidic and directed by the endocrines, is associated with the life spirit and its reflection in the vital body. But on the other hand, the thinking mechanism that is associated with the nervous system is primarily centered in the head, whereas the circulatory system is centered in the heart. And so the last of these to be developed, and by far the most refined, but also the most frail, is the mental system, is the brain nerve system. But it is very much protected by the body. For example, in fasting, or when fasting turns to starvation, if a person dies of starvation, there is very little destruction to the heart, and there's almost no destruction to the nervous system. It all is, the first things to go are muscles, and of the vital organs, the first of the vital organs to go is the spleen, because it is probably the least necessary. But in terms of evolution, it's the other way around. The nerves represent the last thing that we developed, the mind, and that mind, as we know it, is so oriented to the physical world that as the physical world goes into decadence or is burned up to be dissolved and digested and assimilated back into the inner consciousness in the Jupiterian second half of things, the nervous system will be the first thing to go. And so the whole idea, any idea of death and decapitation is indicative of that. It indicates that the spirit, if you want to look at it in one sense, the spirit is being separated from the body, but in the other sense, it is the recognition of the fact that it is a deathly process that is taking place. So again, we have a bride that is associated with heaven, only in this case the dweller is associated with a masculine force which is not gender correct. This large Ifrit clearly represents the powers of the lower nature, and to a large extent the lower nature has control of most of our psychic faculties. As much as we think we're self-conscious, it isn't until we see how much in control the lower nature is that is beneath our the threshold of our waking consciousness, that we see it's really in charge of things. If I go walking down the hall and suddenly there's a pretty girl approaching me, no matter how hard I try to be straight and pure, somehow my foot will slap down a little more noisily or something like that, and it'll always be that, even the control of my physical is to a large extent in the hands of something that is beyond me. Now we find this Ifrit in charge of most of the soul power. And if we look at, you know what a buckler is, don't you? It's a large circular shield that is concave and convex. It looks like this. And if instead of wearing it as a shield across the front of the body, if the Ifrit is human-like, and he's wearing a buckler, it would look like this. So we have the whole notion of he has the soul energy in his, the receptive soul qualities are associated with this Ifrit. Even more than that, especially like the Incas in South America used to do their early levitation by having concave dishes like that. That there's something about gold that, as heavy as it is the easiest thing to levitate. It is capable, it is what is used for transducing power out of the ethers into the physical, because it is a flat crystal is what gold represents, and a flat crystal of the highest order, and so it is capable of bringing energies down like that. This is all just side trips. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with the thing. And then we come to a theme that is one of the largest themes in spiritual mythology, even in academic, intellectual mythology. One of the greatest works that has ever been written on mythology is many volumes long, and it is by Sir James Frazer, who dug into all myths of all sorts, and he wrote a book called The Golden Ball. Eventually, I hope to have a reference copy of it in the store here because it is still available in its full form. The golden bough was the twig from a tree that occasionally a conifer produced a twig that was golden. And when you presented Charon with the piece of the golden bough and gave it to him, he would ferry you across the waters of the Stygian marsh into the underworld in Hades. Some people believe that the golden bough was not from a spruce or any other conifer. Some folks believe that it was mistletoe. What we're talking about, the reason I think why they call it a conifer is because in the conifers, more than any other tree that we know of, the leader principle is formed. That because it has this one straight leader, all of the stronger your leader, the more the branches occur at right angles. And in the conifers, all of them have the single leader. Whereas you take something like an oak tree or an elm tree divides, and because an elm tree divides in a Y-like fashion, it never has any right-angled branches. Oak trees have right-angled branches, but it isn't the general structure of things. This, in its pyramid shape, indicates the whole principle of hierarchy. It represents, if you've ever crawled up in a large conifer, it represents the way the planes set themselves out at right angles to one common stream of consciousness that runs through them. This is obviously like the staff of life. The fact that someone has a twig, in this case it's a twig of silver and diamond rather than gold, and I don't have any explanation for that, or don't even have any thoughts on that. But this shows that one is aware and conscious of the divine heritage, and that it isn't just somebody that has died that is going across into the realms of the spirit. It is somebody that is aware, it is golden. The spiritual awareness and the connection to the grand hierarchy is awake in this individual, and they can show their presence. So what he is doing is a little bit different than it is in classical Greek mythology, but Turkey and Greece can't be too much like each other. It's a rather rugged disagreement they have with each other. But it is the other way around. As he enters the inner worlds or goes to this rare place on the buckler of the Ifrit, carried off by the soul power, he grabs pieces from the tree. The things that are taken along by the princess, who again is the bride from heaven, but she's an unwilling bride this time. But in this case, it's actually a turnaround, because we're saying that the young man represents the higher self and she represents the lower self. She takes with her the needle, that's something I don't know about, and I could certainly stand help. It's something that is common to all hero myths, or quite a few hero myths. Everybody from Achilles to Oedipus to the firstborn of Jacob, Reuben. There's always the thing, you remember in the Old Testament when it says, I shall bruise his heel, speaking of the satanic powers, there's something about the defilement of humanity and the fall into matter and the ultimate fall of human beings in pride that is associated with the heel. It's a theme that's going to come up next semester again, but it is a theme that I don't clearly understand. So when she takes along the needle and she puts it in her heel as a pincushion, I do understand taking the candle along, because that's taking a false light, and it's not the true light, because the true light, everything in the spiritual worlds is lit from itself, and it doesn't need the candle. Remember when we looked at East of the Sun and West of the Moon, that is one of the little vignettes we declined to look in on, was the place of the candle and making the tallow spots on the prints. But at any rate, we have an association there. Then there's a theme here that I would like to know more about the psychology of, and maybe Lou and I can talk about it sometime. I know both Freud and Jung write about it, but I haven't reached those parts in Freud and Jung. And that is the desire that is common in human beings, even into their earliest childhood, the desire to be invisible. And in some cases, it represents a desire to be ultimately pure. Because if you're ultimately pure of taint or tint that comes from taint, then you're transparent and everybody can see through you, and when they see through you, they see the light that shines through, that is not yourself. That's one very clear meaning of invisibility, but that is not what is always intended when a child wishes that it's invisible. There's also a quality of power if you're invisible. The wiliness in human beings and the ability to fool other people spiritually means all you have to do is be able to function consciously one plane higher than they can function, and then you can you are invisible and you're antecedent. You're more at the realm of causes where they are only dealing with consequences. That only carries so far. When you get to the world, I guess, of life spirit, that's all done for. In this case, he's trying to be invisible. He's trying to, the perfect idea of art is invisibility. If you can bring truth or beauty to someone in such a way that the art isn't even visible to the person, we are not awed by the art, but that you see the beauty. This is why I don't like Marlon Brando as an actor, because you know he's acting when he's acting. Whereas there are other people like Dustin Hoffman. When Dustin Hoffman acts, he's in the character, and the art is invisible. Like when you saw Rain Man, that to me was a phenomenally good acting job, because there's somebody that's autistic in this neighborhood. And he has exactly the same characteristics that Dustin Hoffman did, only it wasn't such a thing like, he was truly invisible about doing it. We better be careful. We're getting long. We're at 45 minutes almost already. I'll get a long read now. I have to start reading all over again, or Eli will never forgive me. Then they went on still further till they came to another garden, where every tree was sparkling with gold and precious stones. Here too the youth broke off a twig and shoved it into his pocket, and immediately the earth and the sky shook, and the rustling of the trees said, "There's a child of man here torturing us. There's a child of man here torturing us." So that both he and the damsel nearly fell from the buckler in their fright. Not even the Ifrit knew what to make of it. After that they came to a bridge, and beyond the bridge was a fairy palace. And there an army of slaves awaited the damsel, and with their hands straight down by their sides they bowed down before her till their foreheads touched the ground. The Sultan's daughter dismounted from the Ifrit's head. The youth also leaped down, and when they brought the princess a pair of slippers covered with diamonds and precious stones, the youth snatched one of them away and put it in his pocket. The girl put on one of the slippers, being unable to find the other, sent for another pair, when presto, one of those also disappeared. At this the damsel was so annoyed that she walked on without slippers. But the youth with the turban on his head and the whip and the carpet in his hand followed her everywhere like a shadow. So the damsel went on before, and he followed her into a room, and there he saw the dark Peri, one whose arms touched the sky, while the other arms swept the ground. He angrily answered the damsel where she had been all the time, and why she hadn't come sooner. The damsel told him about the youth who had arrived the evening before, and about what had happened on the way. But the Peri comforted her by saying that the whole thing was fancy, and she was not to trouble herself about it any more. After that he sat down with the damsel and ordered a slave to bring them sherbet. Soon a slave brought the noble drink in a lovely diamond cup, but just as he was handing it to the Sultan's daughter, the invisible youth gave the hand of the slave such a wrench that he dropped and broke the cup to pieces. A piece of this also the youth concealed in his pocket. "Now didn't I say that something was wrong?" cried the Sultan's daughter. "I want no sherbet, nor anything else. I think I had better get back again as soon as possible." "Tush, tush," said the Ifrit, and he ordered the other slaves to bring them something to eat. So they brought a little table covered with many dishes, and they began to eat together. Whereupon the hungry youth also set to work, and the villains disappeared as if three were eating instead of two. I met a man once that could leave the body consciously, and you know what he did nights? Instead of working as an invisible helper, he went at the etheric banquets. Yeah, and he met all kinds of people, just like you do at Rotary clubs and things like that. It just blew me away. I couldn't figure out. I was stunned. I stood there looking at him, and he thought I was stunned, looking at him in awe, because he could go into the inner planes. And I was stunned for what he was doing with it. And the Peri himself began then to be a little impatient, when not only the food but also the forks and spoons began to disappear. And he said to his sweetheart, the Sultan's daughter, that perhaps it would be as well if she did make haste home again. First of all, the dark Ifrit wanted to kiss the girl, but the youth slipped in between them, pulled them asunder, and one of them fell to the right and the other to the left. They both turned pale, called the Lala with his buckler. The damsel sat upon it and went away. But the youth took down a sword from the wall, bared his arm, and with one blow chopped off the head of the dark Peri. No sooner has his head rolled from his shoulders than the heavens roared so terribly, and the earth groaned so horribly, and a voice cried so mightily, "Woe to us, a child of man hath slain our king," that the terrified youth knew not whether he stood on his head or on his heels. Finally, a story with some real excitement in it. It's literally the case that supposedly at least one person near the last initiation has the word that holds and controls the world, and that the uttering of that word can literally shake and destroy the world, bring it all apart. We again have in the Peri the greater dweller. We have the same kind of situation as we did with Perseus, the Medusa being the lesser dweller, the personal evil, and then the great beast, the great sea beast, being the greater dweller. In this case, I don't agree again with the timing of it, but in this case, the confrontation of the greater dweller has to come first. That may be because this is a society where there is not a lot of individualism, and the individual is not well developed, and the social consciousness, which is almost racial in context, might be the first thing that has to be confronted and destroyed on the spiritual path, but that's all just speculation. He becomes almost too confident or overconfident, and for this reason he must be careful about, must remain invisible, and if he does make part of himself visible, only his arm. What I'm trying to get at here is that this kind of confidence is necessary, this kind of innocence, this kind of purity is necessary to do the work that has to be done. Because if the Ifrit, the larger Ifrit, the Peri, represents the macrocosmic evil, represents the greater dweller, it also represents the unconscious control by all of the divinities, which in a way are our enemies to soul growth. If it indeed stretches from one arm touching the earth and the other arm touching the top of the heavens, this represents a hierarchy or a pole of consciousness that has great extent. And what we're talking about here, though this is clearly only a first initiation kind of story, is exactly the kind of thing that Heindel in the Rosicrucian teachings talks about when he says, man, when self-control he gains, frees himself from all the powers that hold the world enchained. And that it's a Goethe statement. And this is what is represented by our hero, by the initiate. He has self-control. He's picking up the powers of heaven by the way. And in so doing, he is free and powerful in himself and to his own ends. Now, he doesn't destroy the whole cosmos, but he destroys the cosmos as it controls him and as it rules him, and he becomes a free individual. This is what initiation is all about, is the reaching out for and attaining to freedom. I have one little section to go, because he's obviously done his work. He seized his carpet, sat upon it, gave it one blow with his whip, and when the Sultan's daughter returned to the palace, she found there the youth snoring in his room. "O thou wretched bald pate," cried the damsel viciously, "what a night I've had of it! So much the worse for thee." Then she took out a needle and pricked the youth in the heel, and because he never stirred, she fancied he was asleep and lay down to sleep herself also. Next morning, when she awoke, she bade the youth prepare for death, as his last hour had come. "Nay," replied he, "not to thee do I owe an account of myself. Let us both come before the Padishah." Then they led him before the father of the damsel, but he said he would only tell them what had happened in the night if they called all the people of the town together. In that way I shall find my brother, perhaps, he thought. So the town crier called all the people together, and the youth stood on a high dais beside the Padishah and the Sultana, and began to tell them the whole story from the Ifrit's buckler to the parrot king. "Believe him not, my lord Padishah and father. He lies, my lord father and Padishah," stammered the damsel, whereupon the youth drew from his pocket the diamond twig, the twig of gems, the golden slipper, the precious spoons and forks. Then he went on to tell them of the death of the dark Peri, when all at once he caught sight of his elder brother, whom he had been searching for so long. He had now neither eyes nor ears for anything else, but leaped off the dais, forced his way on and on through the crowd to his brother till they both came together. Then the elder brother told their story, while the younger brother begged the Padishah to give his daughter and half the kingdom to his elder brother. He was quite content, he said, with the magic turban and the magic whip and the carpet to the day of his death, if he only might live close to his elder brother. But the Sultan's daughter rejoiced most of all when she heard of the death of the parrot king. He had carried her off by force from her room one day, and so enchanted her with his power that she had been unable to set herself free. In her joy she agreed that the youth's elder brother should be her lord, and they made a great banquet at which they feasted 40 days and 40 nights with one another. I was also there and begged so much pilaw from the cook, and I got so much in the palm of my hand that I limp to this day. It's obviously a very good storyteller, because he has to say how it was there. It's very clear that, but there are a number of themes here. This is the union of brothers in the optimal sense, like that of Castor and Polydeuces. He gives over the powers to his brother who can rule them in the world. And when we reach a divine union inside of ourselves, we no longer argue with ourselves, but we have a really good internal positive conversation. And the things that are due to the material side of us, the perceptive work, the taking care of the physical, are given to them. And giving the princess to his brother represents that. In fact, in the time when, in very early Greece, when the initiates were open, they had two kings. They had a divine king and they had a worldly king who was called the Tanist. And the Tanist took care of the worldly occupations, and the divine king took care of the divine things. And they represented the two sides of beings. This is a great union of microcosm and macrocosms, because he proclaims, how does it say in the Bible, who proclaims me, him will I also proclaim. And that's the state where the younger brother is in. He proclaims the truth, and because of that, by his fruits he's known. He's got all of the goods. He can materialize things from the spiritual worlds, and the truth is proclaimed in him because of what he is and how he lives. And it clearly shows that he has his values in the right place, because this is none other than the temptation of Christ to take the whole world to himself and to be wealthy and to have all the powers. And no, he seeks first the kingdom of heaven, and all of that comes to him if he wants it, but he really doesn't want it. What he wants is the spiritual side. So it's a lovely resolution of the hero myth, and the hero myth in the two fighting brothers. Now, I want to go back and finish up that we've been intermittently, intermittently I guess is a good enough term, we've been intermittently having heroines in folklore as representing initiation, and I have one more heroine in folklore that I want to do, and because it comes out with some lovely sides about initiation that don't come out in other ones. It's very short. It's about 3 pages long. It's the fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin. There was once upon a time a poor miller who had a very beautiful daughter. Now it happened one day that he had an audience with the king. And in order to appear a person of some importance, he told him that he had a daughter who could spin straw into gold. Now that's a talent worth having, said the king to the miller. If your daughter is as clever as you say, bring her to my palace tomorrow, and I'll put her to the test. When the girl was brought to him, he led her into a room full of straw, gave her a spinning wheel and a spindle, and said, now set to work and spin all night till early dawn, and if by that time you haven't spun the straw into gold, you shall die. Then he closed the door behind him and left her inside. Same kind of thing that our last hero was confronted with. Either you make it to the realms of immortality or you die. And if you're bound in fear, if you're bound in the illusion of the material world, death seems about the worst thing that can happen to you, or about the worst thing that you can do. And any time that you set on into the spiritual life, you have that same kind of thing. You must confront death. And if death represents our greatest illusion and the limits of the material world, represent all of the things in ourselves that are hardened and crystallized. If we want to be heroes and if we want to be initiates, we have to take on the ultimate limitations of the world. And it turns out that those limitations very often mean facing death. And a lot of people have been initiated when their life was in peril. And it depended on their will, on their ability to take life, on their ability to penetrate the illusion of fear, that their continuance was maintained and that they excelled into the level that would be called initiation into the spiritual worlds. Millers. It's a theme that's going to come up. I think it's probably going to come up when we talk about Heracles next semester. Millers are those who grind under the wheel. That is, under the wheel of fate or destiny. Because we're all grinding out our destiny day by day. The mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. And when we are trapped within destiny, because we are bound by our desires to our actions and to the fruits of our actions, rather than freely acting and being suspended within our consciousness and destiny, we're all millers. And this is also the psychology that this is very true to nature. Our parents always seem to think too much of us because they have hopes that where they failed, we'll make it. And your parents almost always seem to put you into a trick by expecting too much of you and then asking you to pull it off. And again, this is a case just exactly like the last hero that we looked at. You notice that almost all of these heroes are nameless, the heroes and heroines. They hardly ever tell a name, because that makes it much easier for the candidate to identify with the hero or heroine and literally live out the myth of ultimate success, where you champion over death and enter into the inner life. But in the same as our last hero, there's a challenge, and that challenge is what brings out the best. Well, we're going to get through this, I think, in 3 hits. Very short. We'll be within an hour and a half. The poor miller's daughter sat down and didn't know what in the world she was to do. She hadn't the least idea of how to spin straw into gold, and became at last so miserable that she began to cry. Suddenly the door opened, and in stepped a tiny little man, who said, "Good evening, Miss Miller Maid. Why are you crying so bitterly?" "Oh," answered the little girl, "I have to spin straw into gold and haven't a notion of how it's done." "What will you give me if I spin it for you?" asked the mannequin. "My necklace," replied the girl. The little man took the necklace, sat himself down at the wheel, and whir, 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 the wheel went around 3 times and the bobbin was full. Then he put on another, and whir, 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 the wheel went round 3 times and the second was full. And so it went on till morning, when all the straw was spun away and all the bobbins were full of gold. As soon as the sun rose, the king came, and when he perceived the gold, he was astonished and delighted. But his heart only lusted more than ever after precious metal. He had the miller's daughter put into another room full of straw, much bigger than the first, and bade her, if she valued her life, spin it all into gold before the following morning. The girl didn't know what to do and began to cry. Then the door opened as before, and the tiny little man appeared and said, "What will you give me if I spin the straw into gold for you?" "The ring from my finger," answered the little girl. The mannequin took the ring and whirr, around went the spinning wheel again, and when morning broke he had spun all the straw into glittering gold. The king was pleased beyond measure at the sight, but his greed for gold was still not satisfied, and when he had the miller's daughter brought into a bigger room full of straw, he said, "You must spin all this away in the night, but if you succeed this time, you shall become my wife." "She's only a miller's daughter, it's true," he thought, "but I couldn't find a richer wife if I were to search the whole world over." When the girl was alone, the little man appeared for the third time and said, "What'll you give me if I spin the straw for you once again?" "I've nothing more to give," answered the girl. "Then promise me when you are queen to give me your first child." "Who knows what mayn't happen before that," thought the miller's daughter, and besides she saw no other way out of it. So she promised the mannequin what he demanded, and he set to work and spun the straw into gold. When the king came in the morning and found everything as he had desired, he straightway made her his wife, and the miller's daughter became a queen. This is another work story again. Spinning obviously represents the rotation of consciousness. Looking from the inside out or from the outside in, it looks differently. But consciousness, anything that is conscious, that is in existence, spins. Or it spins like that, one way or the other. One kind of spinning represents an involutionary consciousness, a consciousness that propels one into matter. One represents an evolutionary consciousness where one is propelled or spun out of matter. The process of spinning then represents the taking of an attitude of mind and consciously spinning and changing the character of things. In involution, everything becomes more and more separative. Everything becomes more and more discrete and fragmented. In the process of spinning into evolutionary consciousness, all the little threads of destiny that we have get united into one strand of consciousness, which eventually gets woven into the general fabric of the cosmos. So the process of spinning represents taking lines of consciousness and unifying them. And when they are unified and brought into the general line, there is much greater strength in them. But this is something that requires enormous skill, because to produce an even thread in spinning is something that takes years and years of ability and very agile hands to do. As it is in most of our lives, looking at the parallel, most of our lives are uneven. We have ups and downs, and some things we have a glut of activity in, and other things we have sparsity in. Because it took so many years to learn even how to spin, and to spin well, this is why the daughter that was considered the ugliest daughter was made to be the one to learn spinning, because she wasn't going to get married and have children anyway. And this is where our term spinster comes from, is from that kind of consciousness. What we're talking about here is we're talking about straw, which represents the worthless part of the grain. The worthless part of the grain, most of which, all of the grains were the property of Demeter. And Demeter, as pictured in the zodiac, was none other than Virgo, with the shocks of grain in her hand. And the straw being woven into gold means to take the husks of matter, means to take the worthless experiences of the world and transmute them through the spinning consciousness into a spiritual kind of gold that is part of the soul body. It's literally the case. I know someone who is a friend of all of us, that this someone once did a deed to help somebody else that took great self-sacrifice. And the somebody else he was helping was an involuntary clairvoyant. And it was one of the biggest experiences of her life to see him do this deed for her sake out of the goodness of her heart. And then she literally saw a little spiral of gold go into his aura, and then it was invisible. And it's that kind of a thing that is involved here. In this case, the groom from heaven is portrayed as a greedy king. And that is a way, if we're looking from our lower consciousness, truly the spirit is king and is tyrant, and it certainly seems greedy because it wants more and more and more from us all the time until it gets to be like that Maudlin song, all of you, I only want all of you, something of that nature. Always for more soul. There's nothing that will satisfy it but ever more soul that is given in love. Now there's something really interesting here. That is that the gremlin, who again represents the dweller-like consciousness, but represents the dweller-like consciousness as it is found as instinct in the bodies of our personality. It is seen as a little thing. And do you know that more devils in lore are pictured as little things than as bigger things? And this is perfectly the case because most people who put themselves in such a place to see such entities and beings are the ones that are Jupiterian, overconfident, and very bombastic. The Saturnian types are all too worldly wise, and they would just stay in the material world. No, why don't worry about those spiritual worlds? So if you're overconfident, or if you have this big spirit about you, then the manifestation of evil as it is consolidated in you appears to be almost negligible. And so the demonic being looks like some kind of runty little thing. It couldn't give you any trouble at all. So it's exactly what we would expect from the overconfidence of the miller. Now, it's interesting. This portrays another part of the function of soul growth. And it's really a neat one. It's a neat one because if we remember from the two caskets, when the young woman was supposed to carry water in a sieve and to turn white black and black white and do all of those kinds of things, it was the birds as intuitions that told her what to do. She carried it out, but in this case the carrying out is done by the lower nature, by the instinct within the lower nature. And this fairy tale really fulfills what it's like, because the desire body, the etheric body, and the physical body have to do the work. The spirit can't do the work. The spirit can assimilate, but the bodies still have to do the work. And therefore, how does it go? There's a line that I love so much I think it is in the book of Revelation. And it says, "And the wise shall be captured in their folly." And this is exactly the way it is, that the motivation of the lower nature is all selfish, and it hopes it's going to have this divine youth and this power to itself all alone, and so it does all of the work. You see that the way it works, we always get topped. Lou knows all about what are called symptomatic actions. That is, they're called like Freudian slips. That very often, when we're not consciously in control, we slip and we show what our hidden inner motivation is. But when you look at that in truth, it isn't that we have discovered what our lower motivation is. It's what is behind that. The Spirit has caused it to disclose itself. And everything serves the good. Everything serves the God within. And so even the lower nature, in its own greed, it has all of the wisdom of the Spirit in it as instinct. And it knows how to use the vital body and the desire body and all of those faculties that we have inside of us to its own ends. And it gets motivated by greed, and the thing that it doesn't have is creativity. It can't create something new. And this is why there is always that, like what was behind that movie of about 20 years ago called Rosemary's Baby. There was that notion that the devil can't procreate, so it needs humans. Or it's in the book you just read, A Strange Story, that the divine always needs a human to carry something out, and the lower nature hopes for the immortal creativity that is indicated by the babe that it will have for itself, and that it'll redeem itself in the rejuvenescence of the little child. And so we have the lower nature then gladly doing all of the work, spinning the base metal into gold, and doing it very in earnest, meeting all the deadlines because it wants something ultimately for itself. It's an interesting thing. I don't think there are very few people that have ever gotten on the path whose motivation was completely pure to begin with. But even the impure motivation was the carrot at the end of the stick to serve the higher purposes. We have just about 3 paragraphs. When a year had passed, a beautiful son was born to her, and she thought no more of the little man till all of a sudden one day he stepped into her room and said, "Now give me what you promised." The queen was in a great state and offered the little man all the riches in her kingdom if he would only leave her the child. But the mannikin said, "No, a living creature is dearer to me than all the treasures in the world." Then the queen began to cry and sobbed so bitterly that the little man was sorry for her and said, "I'll give you 3 days to guess my name, and if you find it out in that time, you may keep your child." The queen pondered the whole night over all the names she had ever heard, and sent a messenger to scour the land and to pick up far and near any names he should come across. When the little man arrived on the following day, she began with Caspar, Melchior, Belshazzar, and all the other names she knew in a string. But at each one the mannikin called out, "That's not my name." The next day she sent to inquire the names of all the people in the neighborhood, and had a long list of the most uncommon and extraordinary for the little man when he made his appearance. "Is your name perhaps Sheepshanks, or Cruikshanks, or Spindleshanks?" But he always replied, "That's not my name." On the 3rd day the messenger returned and announced, "I have not been able to find any new names, but as I came upon a high hill round the corner of the wood where the foxes and hares bid each other good night, I saw a little house, and in front of the house burned a fire, and round the fire sprang the most grotesque little man, hopping on one leg and crying, "Tomorrow I brew, today I bake, then the child away I'll take. For little deems my royal dame that Rumpelstiltskin is my name." You may imagine the queen's delight at hearing the name, and when the little man stepped in shortly afterwards and asked, "Now, my lady, what's my name?" she asked first, "Is your name Conrad?" "No." "Is your name Harry?" "No." "Is your name perhaps Rumpelstiltskin?" "Some demon has told you, some demon has told you that," screamed the little man, and in his rage he drove his foot so far into the ground that it sank in up to his waist, and then in a passion he seized the left foot with both hands and tore himself in two. Again, we have a very common theme that we found in all of these initiate myths, the year's probation. And it isn't necessarily the year that counts, but the year represents an entire cycle. All of the qualities, all of the trials of a single year, such as when Apollo wrestled with this great serpent, Pythias, and after he had defeated Python, he became called Apollo Pythias, who sees all and knows all, and became the god of prophecy and wisdom and knowledge. And it is to say that in a one-year circuit or cycle, all of the qualities and all of the trials that are inherent in them are experienced. And so we have that sort of thing. And so we also have a kind of audacity on the part of the little man. It was audacious of us in the first place to fall in our rebellion. And there was confidence, so much confidence. This is the other side of confidence. There's a cockiness in Rumpelstiltskin because he believes that he can give her an extra 3 days. Again, that's that 3 days, the amount of time that one used to spend in initiation out of the body, becoming a thrice born. And on the third day, like they used to be initiated in the Great Pyramid, and they were laid in the manger. And when they were laid in the manger, they were taken out of the body in 3 days and in transmit and taken into the inner worlds. And on the morning of the third day, inclusive reckoning, the sun shone on their faces through a set of mirrors and tubes, and they were back in the physical body. There's much more that has to do with the three succeedent days in the fulfillment of the evolutionary half of evolution, but that's all so much mentalism. What I'm trying to get at is that sin always oversteps itself. It has an overconfidence that feels that it's invulnerable, and when it oversteps itself, it always ends up losing. The initiate always has the intuition, and sending out messengers is like the Mercury of the Norse, Wotan, who had 2 ravens, forethought and afterthought, that he sent out into the world, and they kept bringing back messages of everything that was going out into the world. It's sort of like cast your bread on the waters, that if you're in a pinch, as our heroine is in a pinch, the messenger she's sending out, those are just physical symbols of the way one casts oneself afield in order to gain new experience, new knowledge. It's sort of like a hatching problem. It isn't just the chicken and the egg. You have the hatching from the warmth of your own being that you permeate and that you send out, and it brings back new experience. In this case, it brings back the very thing that she was looking for. In the Trinity of things, there are meanings. And the meanings are the understanding. They are the things that unite things. The expression of meaning comes in words. And then when words become objectified, when there are outcroppings of the creative medium, and they become things that are embedded in the words, they become names. And the names are associated with the focus of individuality, with the focus of self. So someone coming into spiritual self-knowledge, the divine knowledge that allowed our previous hero to overpower all of the forces in the world, when one comes in, one then learns one's true name. Again, in the book of Revelation, which is a book of initiation, it is said, "He that overcometh, I will give a new name." But one doesn't learn that new name all in one word. It is supposedly a seven-voweled word, which, according to the Orient, has all seven vowels in it, and they make they have an exoteric word called Oihahu that has all seven vowels in it, and that represents the divine name. Because our name is literally the name of God. And that syllable by syllable, as we come into the powers that are within us, we learn all seven syllables of what we are, and we resonate them as individual foci of the universe. See, this is the word out of which the name is an outcropping, is a very common thing. This is, are you familiar with the lost word of Freemasonry or the lost chord of esoteric music? It's not a material chord, something that you can play with your ears. It's a lost word because when we became focused in what actually is a lower state, which would be a false name or a nickname, we lost our association with our true name, and we lost our association with the word of power, the word of healing. Christ is very clear, for example, in the Gospels, in saying that among those born of women, as if to say that there's another way that one can be born. And one is clearly can be born of the Word, and that's exactly what we're talking about our heroine in Rumpelstiltskin. So the word is fused the name is fused into the word, and when we know the word, when we know the life spirit, the selfness, we know our true self, and we get to become and know ourselves. And so we intuitively begin to discover this. And the thing is that through this process of spinning, where we spin the soul back into spirit, that kind of knowledge, we become spiritually empowered. And then in the focus of the threefold spirit through the mind, that empowerment we can utilize. The whole process of initiation is attunement. The keys to the kingdom are like musical keys. When we, at one level, what is a sound is a color. And what is a color on another level is another quality. And when we attune ourselves, to use the modern jargon, when we vibrate to a given quality and we can live that quality, we then have the ability to know that vowel of our name. This is what is behind all clairvoyance. It is the ability to attune our consciousness to the thing that we are experiencing. And so the whole process of learning what our name is and what the words are